Hi, thanks for coming back. Here's one of the main reasons that I really love watercolour pencils for sketching. And this is it. That's all you need for a day's sketching. So we have a small sketchbook, a water brush, I'll explain more in a minute, a pen, a pencil, a rubber, a pencil sharpener, and something around 20 assorted watercolour pencils. All of this will fit nicely in an ordinary pencil case. A set that you buy in a tin will be usually a conventional rainbow, not the best that you might need for drawing buildings or landscape outside. Assuming you make a selection from your local art shop, I would recommend indigo and either sepia or burnt umber to make some good darks. And as many greens as you feel you can afford. Personal choice, really. I don't want to get into too much detail about that right now. One last point though is that black should be avoided because it just makes your other colours look dirty, not darker, so avoid that. Anyway, now I'm going to talk a little bit more about all sorts of other materials and things that we will need. So hi, I'm making myself visible this time. Before we get into any more detail about the watercolour pencils, I wanted to share the thing that helped me make the biggest progress in sketching. And it's this. It's just that I bought a small sketchbook. Before I'd been using A4, and it's a much bigger statement, and also you're setting yourself a larger task. Whereas if you've got a little thing like this, you can just scribble something that you happen to see in a cafe. And it doesn't take very long, and if you're using watercolour pencils, it's not very obtrusive. Half the time, people don't notice you're doing it, and that suits me fine, because I'm not a professional artist, as you can see. I'm just somebody that gets a lot of pleasure and enjoyment out of sketching and drawing. Having twigged that, I then went on and bought more sketchbooks, and I've used these ones for years. Again, you can see from the size, they're pretty small. Get it closer. It's a Strathmore product, and this is toned grey sketch paper, 50 sheets. So I've always used this for my watercolour pencils. It's not strictly watercolour paper, but I started off using this book with a different set of pencils, and they weren't watercolour pencils, they were just rather nice set from Watercolor in deep sepia and sanguine and dark, and I was like using them. And then gradually I started adding a little bit of colour because I realised that the grey paper made the colour pop out, and I'm afraid to say that my method of applying the colour for this instance was lick and spit and then rubbing it in. But you have to say, I think it made a great result. It sort of rubs the colour into the paper without using, obviously, a lot of liquid. And I know it's unhygienic, but it's just my sketchbook, so I can do what I like, okay? But since then, I've always used this toned paper because I like being able to add the highlights as white. And sometimes watercolour paper sketchbooks. And they work fine for watercolour pencils as long as you don't pick anything that's too rough. The jargon for watercolour paper is a little strange. You have hot pressed, which is smooth and rather shiny, and I don't particularly like that. And then there's rough, which is what it says on the tin. And again, for watercolour pencils, I think that texture is too textured for what we're using, especially on a small scale, so I don't use that. What I do quite like is the paper that's called cold pressed. I'm sorry, that was Lily. Lily has opinions. Lily is a cat, obviously. The best watercolour paper to use for watercolour pencils is cold pressed, and that's the medium texture, sometimes called knot, because it's not hot pressed. I don't know, a bit mad. Anyway, now, watercolour paper is relatively expensive, so I've got some news on the blog. I've made a new discovery, partially because of doing this video. video work. And I've discovered this stuff, mixed media art pad, and it comes in all sizes, and I think this is one of the best things for watercolour pencils. And the great thing is it's not expensive. The other fab thing about multimedia paper is it comes in lots of colours, and again I really like that. There's something that people often find intimidating about drawing on white paper, whereas it's just a scribble, but just to show that the colours come up really strong, even though this paper's quite dark. It's darker than my normal sketchbook, and yet the colours come up very well and they zing. And it means that the paper's given you the mid-tone, so all you've got to worry about, as it were, is the highlights and the shadows. So I'm a real convert to multimedia paper. The things I like about it are, it comes in different colours. There's grey, there's beige, there's all sorts of colours, whatever you like, easily available, much easier to find. And it's got a bit of what we call tooth, so the crayon takes to the paper quite comfortably, but not enough texture that it's difficult to wash out with the water. So I'm really getting rather enthused about this. And the other thing is, as you can tell from this, waving it around a bit, you can see it's quite thick, and that is typical of what multimedia paper. It's quite thick, and it'll take a bit of hacking around, and that is good. Again, you can add layers. I don't like to add too many layers because I like my pictures to look quite fresh, but sometimes layers is good, especially if you're building up a depth of colour or working on textures. And it seems very tolerant of that when I'm working on trying things out for these videos, and it doesn't lose its texture too much if you keep working at it. It seems to be quite tough, so that's really good. Multimedia paper does make sense because, after all, watercolour pencils are obviously a sort of multimedia all in themselves. They're both pencil and paint, plus you're using ink as well as water. So it does seem like definitely worth a try. I'd now like to talk a little bit about different types of watercolour pencils. My favourite is Arbrechdürer by Faber-Castell. It's got a great range of colours, and it's a medium price pencil, but Faber-Castell paint out very well, and they have a large range of lovely colours to choose from, and you can buy them singly. The recommended retail price is £2.50, though usually you can get them for less. Other favourites are Derwent, again also widely available as singles, and this is another mid-price range brand. Here is Lyra Rembrandt Lyra, and this is a very good value pencil. It's £1.95 recommended retail price. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It paints out very well indeed, and I suppose the only drawback is that it doesn't have a huge range of colour, but it's a very nice pencil to use. And then if you're on the breaking your budget end of the market, here is the Doyen Caran d'Ache Museum Luminance. They do other pencils as well, Caran d'Ache, which are less exorbitantly expensive, but this retails for the price of £4.15, and even though they are marginally better than Faber-Castell, that's still quite a premium to pay for an admittedly excellent pencil. So I've always stuck with Faber-Castell mostly, but I have always bought my pencils singly, a few at a time, in local art shops or online. I just think it's much more fun to do that. You can choose your colours, get to know them gradually, rather than starting with a great big enormous set, which would be quite a cost. Although, talking about a cost, here is what's called a half pan of watercolour paint. Now this is cobalt blue. Now I'm cheating a little bit because this is one of the most expensive colours on any watercolour range, but this little baby costs, depending on brand, between £9 and £15. So I think we can all see that watercolour pencils are a cheaper option. Other elements of why they're better when you're out and about is you can use cheaper paper, whereas with watercolours, the more you spend on paper, definitely the better the results. But part of the fascination is that this particular blue is translucent, whereas other blues are opaque. Some blues are a bit feeble in washes, whereas others you put the tiniest microbe size of phthalo blue into a wash and everything's bright blue. Watercolour is much harder to handle. Whereas with watercolour pencils, a lot of that faff is taken out of the equation. And as going outside to sketch what you see on the spot, live as it were, is already quite a daunting thing to do for an amateur who just wants to have fun, I do think it's really nice that watercolour pencils take a lot of that stress and worry and complexity out of the equation. Now let's talk about brushes, because again this is something that I've learnt as I've gone along, and I would like to share what I've learnt with you. Initially, because I had done a bit of watercolour painting, I used a watercolour brush, and this is a squirrel mop, and it's difficult to convey this by a video, but I'm doing my best. This is hair, well, presumably squirrel hair, and it's quite soft. It holds an awful lot of water, which when you're doing watercolour painting is great, because that works, and you can do a long line in one brush stroke and it doesn't run out of paint. But I find for watercolour pencils this is too soft, because one of the differences about pencil technique is that you do have to work the paint out a bit on the paper. And so over time I've realised that this sort of synthetic brush, this is a fabulous thing, look. Isn't that neat? Little travel brush. I think that's a Jackson's ones, but there are various makes. And because it's a bit wide, it's very comfortable to hold. But this has been used a bit, so the tip is no longer as white as it used to be. But when it was new, brand new, the tip was bright, and there's quite a bit of spring to it. This is relatively stiff. So when you're working on a watercolour painting and you're tending to nudge the colour to and throw a bit, unlike watercolour, when you just go daub and straight on, I find that these synthetic brushes definitely work better. So here's the final trick about watercolour pencils being great for sketching, and this is a water brush. There are various makes. This one's an old Derwent one. Again, we've got the same sort of brush tip. It's synthetic fibres and is quite stiff, and again when you're working on watercolour pencils do tend to go to and fro to get the colour to come out, so these work better than a soft watercolour hairbrush. And this reservoir here is full of water, so you can see the bubble moving, and that's all the water you need to take for a day's sketching. Contrast that with watercolour, where you can need quite a lot of water, and you also need somewhere to put the water, and you need to not knock the water over. Whereas for us, that's all we need, and it's just so easy. So if you've got this far, thank you very much for watching. I hope you have found it useful and not too quaint and weird. Next time I'm going to look at how we actually use the pencils to create dark and light shading.